Okay, everyone, good afternoon and welcome to another session of the Indeed International Forum. We don't like breaks in this forum, so we go straight into another discussion. The title for this session is Designing Evidence-Based Practice, How to Use Evidence to Design PCVE, De-Radicalization and Crime Prevention Interventions. We have 3 speakers in this session, of which 2 are with us at the moment. We hope that the 3rd speaker will join us very soon. Let me briefly introduce them to you. First, we have with us Teresa Silva, who is Associate Professor of Criminology at Mitt Sweden University. We have with us Svetla Koinova, who is a Research Associate and Project Coordinator at the Violence Prevention Network. And hopefully with us soon is Stijn Arts, who is Coordinator and Research Officer at the European Crime Prevention Network, ECPN. We will proceed here in the following order. Teresa will go first, then Stijn, if he is by that point with us, will be next, and Svetla, you'll be the 3rd speaker. The time limit for each presentation is 12 minutes, so try to more or less stick to it. Of course, if Stijn cannot join us, that will be lenient. Then we'll have a little bit more space, but hopefully at the end of the introductory statements we will have space for a Q&A to all participants. Please feel free to ask your questions not only at the end but also whenever you feel like it's a good moment to intervene, to clarify something. Do not hesitate to reach out either by raising your hand or by asking your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. All right. So with that, let me hand over to Teresa for the first presentation.
So thank you, Stefan. I'm going to upload my PDF file to share with you. And I have to say that I have 14 minutes in the house, so I try to cut some things that I want to say to go as fast as possible. Okay, I hope that you are seeing my presentation now. And first of all, hello and thank you for listening in this second afternoon after Indeed Forum. So as Stefan presented me, I'm Teresa. I'm an Associate Professor of Criminology at Mitt Sweden University. I also work on the advisory board of the Indeed, and scientific advisory board of the Indeed project, and also collaborate with the European Crime Prevention Network. And of all these institutions, we have been trying for some years now to encourage practitioners, policymakers to frame their practice on the evidence-based paradigm. And from the time that I've been working with practitioners, in my case, not only in the PCV field, but also more generally in crime prevention, I could witness the gap that is still I found still the gap between academia and the field work that, in my view, is due to several factors, among them the complicated way that sometimes us academics turn everything. Anyway, what I proposed myself today was to explain the fundamentals of evidence, what is evidence, what the word means, and some practical advices for all those that are going to use evidence. So I prepared this session not for people, not for academics, but for people who are less used to work with evidence, practitioners, policymakers who are not used to search for and interpret evidence. I did not prepare the session for academics. So let me go on my second slide. Yes. So imagine that you have this situation that your boss, wherever you work, comes one day to you and says, okay, we need a program to de-radicalize kids in schools. So the team that gets responsible for design and eventually implementing the program is going to deal with several questions, being the first one most likely, what evidence there is that a program to de-radicalize kids in school is needed. right? So hopefully either you have evidence that the program is necessary already, or you will have to generate that evidence yourselves by answering questions. And the questions in this case can be such things like, how much are the kids radicalized? It is a matter of attitudes, language, or there are also behaviors already on the air. What type of radicalism are we dealing with? It's a matter of only the kids, or are families also radicalized? How serious is the problem? How many kids are affected? And so on. So perhaps you would have to do this needs assessment or situation analysis to generate evidence that a specific type of program is needed. So when you have that figure out, then you ask, okay, so what type of program should we design to maximize the possibilities that we succeed? Here you have two options. Either you intend to reinvent the wheel, start from the scratch, from the beginning, and in that case, you will have to search for evidence that can tell you what is causing the problem, risk factors, correlational variables, etc. Or you do what most of people do, that is copy and paste. And by this, I mean that you consult what others have already done, others who have dealt with the same problem or a similar problem that you are dealing with have already done, and how successful their interventions were. And after you adapt them to your own population characteristics. Either way, what you will be doing in this stage is to use evidence in order to design your own program. So creating and using evidence are two actions that you are supposed to be doing while you develop and implement an intervention. So when you study and analyze the problem, you are creating evidence. When you plan and design your intervention, mainly you will be using evidence previously generated by others. And during implementation, you will be doing both, using it and creating evidence. And when you evaluate, you again are mainly generating evidence. So the question here is, what is evidence? And evidence is no more and no less than information. It's information. Think, for example, on forensic evidence. So, for example, the weapon utilized to commit a crime. Why is the weapon a piece of evidence? Because it proves that what motivated the injuries, damages, wounds, eventually the killing of someone or whatever was victimized on this case. So by evidence, we mean information that proves the truthfulness of an hypothesis, an idea, an object, or an assertion. And by scientific evidence is the same. It refers to information systematically collected and analyzed using scientific methods that prove the truthfulness of an association, of an assertion. For example, my program is successful in de-radicalizing kids. So it is in this sense that we ask, what works? What evidence do we have that education-based programs are useful to de-radicalize kids? And what evidence do we have that it works with younger kids, or that it works in other environments than the schools? Is it better to apply them in an intensive format, or shall we extend it through the academic year? And etc. Right? So this is what evidence is about. So first of all, where can I find scientific evidence? How do we do it? And how will I find studies that, for instance, compare different educative programs so that I can perhaps choose or have an approach closer to those that have shown to be more successful? Or perhaps if I decide that that we must to reinvent the wheel and start from the beginning, where can I read about the causes of the problem or correlational factors that I need to target in the activities that I plan in my intervention? And let me just tell that finding evidence takes time. You need to allocate a certain amount of time to find, read, and understand what scientific studies have done and have found. So there are several sites that you can use to access the different types of studies. You have repositories such as the one that I am presenting for you here, and I'm showing in this slide, and which is an outcome of the Indeed project. There are other sites that I will show in one moment, but let's have just a quick view on what this repository is and how it works. In this case, what you have is a collection of studies organized in two clusters. First are studies about that specifically target risk and protective factors for PCVE. And second, you have studies that show the efficacy and effectiveness of interventions. In this case, on the case of risk factors, when you access the website, you can choose several parameters, such as the type of population you want to work with, specific factors, place where the research was done, and so on. The case of the menu that I put here for you, that I show here, for example, is when you click on study population. So if you introduce, for example, adolescents, for instance, the repository will give you back only studies done in adolescent populations. One important site that you might find useful too is Compel collaboration. In this case, what you will find are what we call evidence synthesis, systematic reviews and meta-analytic studies, considering those that produce the better or the highest level of evidence. These studies are a bit special because instead of, for instance, study the effectiveness of an adequative program implemented by one group, what these studies do is to gather all the studies with certain characteristics. For instance, look into all studies that measure the effectiveness of outline interventions for reducing hate speech and cyber hate, and compare each other to find what works and what does not. So in Compel collaboration, you have free access online, and you can choose all areas or reduce your search to certain fields. For example, crime and justice comprises in this moment 64 systematic reviews. But you can also search for education, international development, social welfare, and other areas. Another free search tool is PubMed. I use PubMed for my own research because you have this advanced search engine in which you can combine expressions or words. It is perhaps very small here. I don't know if you can see it, but I introduce, in this case, risk factors and combine it with extremism, and I obtain 34 results. In this case, I will try also with risk factors and radicalization, and instead of extremism, and most likely I would find a different number of these 34. In most cases, the articles or the scientific evidence that each one of the terms gives back to you will overlap, but after, again, you have to take time to see what studies are the same that you find with one and the another expression, and what studies did you gain for each one of the expressions. So again, you will have to take some time to figure it out. So the result of the search in PubMed is going to be a screen like the one that I am showing to you. And in here, you have the title of the article. It's perhaps very small. You see the title of the article that is supposed to be as descriptive, as most descriptive as possible, the year when the study was published, the journal where the study was published, and the authors. If you click in the study, you will have an abstract that is the summary of the study. And in general, on the summary, you will find what the objective of the study is, a brief explanation of the methods, and the two or three more important results. So from that abstract, in many cases, you can already say, okay, this is important for me to read, or no, this is not important for the problem that I have in my hands. You can also use Google Scholar, who also search for evidence in a similar way that PubMed does. In this case, what you can is introduce a short sentence, as the one I have in this slide, and Google will spit out results that are within a broad area. In this case, you will find several possibilities. Sometimes you have the PDF, and when you click, the file will download automatically in your computer. And if the PDF is not available, Google will send you to the journal site in some occasions, or other sites where the abstract or eventually the whole document is available in other formats. Now, the problem is going to be that in some cases, the studies and articles are behind a paywall. And each time more we researchers try to make available our articles in open access, but we come from a business-like system in which knowledge is considered a privilege for rich people. But so it is good that you have in your WhatsApp in your WhatsApp list that person that works in a university that you can invite perhaps for a couple of beers while she or he downloads for you all the information, studies, articles that you cannot have access for free. Oops. So anyway, getting back to the Indeed repository and looking at that initial search that I put for you on the cluster of risk factors and adolescents, here you have some of the outcomes of that search. So what happens when I click on one of these studies is that I bring to you here the example of this last one, that is the making, oh, I don't want to make it see. This one, that is the making of a radical, the role of peer harassment in youth political radicalism. This can be interesting to read if, as in the hypothetical case scenario that I put for you in the beginning of my presentation, you come up with the task of developing a program in schools. So what will you have if you click on this entrance is something like this. In this case, you have access to it gives access to the whole article that you can download to your computer. And here I want to say that you may find difficult understand what the method and what the results are. You have things like this, for example, in many cases, researchers use complex mathematical models to analyze their data that most people who are not used to work with such statistical tools may not understand. In other occasions, researchers use other type of methods known as qualitative research, and in their results, they may plot complex networks of codes, themes, sub-themes that you may also lose someone who is not used to read and interpret such type of work. So my advice to you is, first, try to figure out what is the objective of the study to decide if it is interesting for you or not. And second, look in the methods to figure out the population in which the researchers did their study, the instruments they used for measurement, the procedure they utilized, and very important, the limitations. You have to think that every study has limitations, and the quality of the evidence you are reading depends on them. So it is important for you to know the limitations of each study. And I also would advise you to, instead of getting lost trying to understand the complexities of the analysis, go directly to the discussion. On the discussion, in general, researchers start by making a brief summary of their objective and the results. And after they compare their results with previous studies, they interpret them in the light of previous research and occasionally some theoretical frameworks. And in the discussion, they do all this without using mathematical or analytical language. I bring here, Stefan, I'm almost finishing. I bring here another example to you. In this case, it is a systematic review. And in this case, it's very normal that you have things like this. On the left side of the screen, what you have is a table that plots the decision tree of the selection. I mean the articles that were selected for the synthesis and how the researchers select the articles, that each decision that they took in each one of the stages of the review. And after, you also may have the other type of table that is on the right, which summarizes the characteristics of each of the studies that were included in the systematic review, either or the meta-analysis. And in this case, you have available in the text key findings that are very easy to understand, even for people who are not used to deal with the complexities of producing research results. So in sum, and to end my presentation, if evidence is no more than information systematically collected and analyzed, in our case, by using scientific methods, it can be more or less easy to interpret and therefore use, but critical appraisal of scientific evidence is a skill that can be developed over time. So more you do, more articles you read, more easy it is to understand and appraise the evidence quality. And that is all that I bring to you today, and thank you for listening.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Teresa. Unfortunately, Stein is not here yet. I hope that that still changes. Let's see. But I would say we move on then to Svetla's presentation. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Teresa. This was very interesting, and I really liked how practical it was. You know, giving people links where to go to, where to look for evidence. I'll also try to stay practical, give practical examples. When Kai and I were discussing what focus we could lay, I was telling him about my experiences as an evaluator, and some of you in the public will know that right now I represent Violence Prevention Network in the consortium of PREVAL. Violence Prevention Network is an organization that's been working in exit programs and working with people who are at risk of getting radicalized for about 20 years now, so secondary and tertiary prevention. I've always now been focused in the past few years on how to evaluate such initiatives. And my background, however, has been also in other kinds of organizations, in civic education and in social work in a more classical sense. And I've always been in charge of internal evaluations. That's been kind of my keystone, what I've been doing. So when we were discussing how can we get it to be as practical as possible in this space, talking about the utilization of evaluation results, what is an aspect that maybe doesn't get talked about a lot? And I decided, yes, internal evaluations is something we don't talk about quite enough. So I'll try to place a bit of a focus on that today. Let me also start my presentation. So I think, first of all, it's important to note that internal evaluations are not just monitoring initiatives. It's not only about deciding on what your goals will be and then checking in the duration of time, how they're developing, what outcomes you're getting. It's more of really a step back, just like external evaluations are. And I think that they, we need both. We need both internal and external evaluations, obviously, but that internal evaluations can serve some different purposes. And I've been doing both self-evaluations. That means in the past, I've also been evaluating actual initiatives that I was also working on. But what I would like to talk about today is more a perspective of in-house evaluation. When one department of one organization is looking at the work of another department while still being part of the same organization. So what does that even look like? I think that normally we've spoken in the past few days, and Michael Quinn-Patton has spoken about that yesterday evening as well. We have a few common challenges to actually using evidence for orienting strategic decision-making. The first is that there are just time constraints laid on any kind of design and implementation of an evaluation design. And often evaluators are very rushed. They do not come in as quickly as it maybe could be possible to give back to practitioners and other stakeholders in terms of interim results. And so lessons learned only get discussed briefly in the end, if they get discussed at all. In some bad experiences, I think some of the listeners maybe could also share, we just get a report and no discussion of the results actually happens between then the evaluators and the people who have put in their time to gather evidence. There's, of course, also the fear of instrumentalization. I think that's especially true in a landscape where there is concurrence existing between different organizations in some kind of a zero-sum game of who's going to get the funding money. But I think it's also fear of, political instrumentalization and also the instrumentalization by violent extremism actors that plays a role in stopping people from actually taking on the lessons learned and actually doing the uptake that's so necessary if we are looking at evaluations. What could also happen, and I think that's also based on bad experiences, is that evaluators may actually lack real experience in the specific field that they are coming to, or it might just be perceived that way because of past experience. I think the most important aspect, however, that is a detriment to actually getting to utilize the evidence is what research questions are even allowed to be posed in some external evaluations. So often there's a lot of pressure for it to not be so learning based, as we've discussed, I think, during the whole last day, but to be more accountability oriented. The interesting question is never, is this working? It's always what works for whom under what conditions. In order to get to gather data, first of all, and then analyze intended and unintended effects in order to look at interactive effects between different actors in the field of de-radicalization and PCV, you need also a long observation period, and you need qualitative data. You need data of really good quality. So again, the time constraint kicks in. Now, these are lots of problems, obviously. It's not that internal evaluation doesn't have any of them in common with external evaluation, but it helps with a few things. So first of all, you can, if you are doing an in-house evaluation, you have some freedom in deciding what your guiding questions will be. And you can discuss with the stakeholders in the practice organization itself about what is interesting to them, and not only interesting to them in general, but interesting to them in this specific moment. For example, it can be what are the cooperation partners that have been the most meaningful in the casework with specific clients. And that goes back to actually, I think, the presentation of the Indeed evaluation tool, where we were talking about also small evaluation initiatives, where it's really targeted at a specific question or one specific initiative. I think that was module 4 of what you guys just presented. I thought that was really interesting because that's often what, in my experience, gets put forward in terms of needs when we're talking to practitioners. This question of timing is very important. So I put it here as when the practitioner is ready, the evaluator will appear. I think it's common wisdom to say that we should always design evaluations in the beginning of a project so that we can follow through. But what is harder to accomplish sometimes is presenting the data at the appropriate time when it is actually needed, when strategic decisions are being made, or the next funding period is being prepared, or an organization finds itself in an organizational development stage. So that should obviously also be looked at. And now we get to a bit of a touchy subject, because who can be doing in-house evaluations at all? It's not the very small organizations that have only 3 people working on a specific universal prevention, for example, initiative. It's only people with sufficient money that can get in-house researchers to be, playing these games. And the question is, how can we maybe also convince stakeholders that this is work worth doing? And make sure that even if it's based on some narrow focus, still internal evaluation gets picked up. Now, there are some methodological issues with any kind of, obviously with self-evaluation, but also with any kind of internal evaluation. It's important to be taking the bias that exists very seriously, and you still need a lot of triangulation. You still need to get the buy-in of beneficiaries, and in our cases, often clients, if that's possible, but you also get the chance to maybe do that in a more sustainable way. Whereas I think people who for example, aware of how exit programs work, know about the importance of trust between the client and the people that he's working with in the civil society organization he's working with. So it's very important to preserve that trust, even when you are trying to get very neutral data. And internal evaluation makes some of that contact slightly easier. But you still need to be constantly be self-critical. However, that necessary self-reflection, that diversity of hypothesis as well that Michael Quinn-Patton was talking about becomes maybe slightly more easier to accomplish if you know that you don't have to publish all of your results, that you can decide on in your internal evaluation which results you package to whom. And obviously, this is going to be a controversial topic maybe to discuss in the Q&A afterwards, but how is that, what is the most transparent approach really in terms of sharing lessons learned and talking about target group specific presentation of results? And in Germany, I think that's where violence prevention network works mainly. It's a very specific problem because we have very high data protection standards, which we obviously welcome, but that makes it sometimes more difficult to become specific in the way you present results. Now, the question of enabling people to be able to make data-oriented decisions. I'm going to touch slightly on what we found out in Preval, but I want to encourage all of you to share the session on the role of regional and national networks and platforms as tools for learning and improving practice, which is going to be after the break, because my colleagues there will discuss these results more thoroughly. However, there again, we were trying to look at what are tools to enable people to make decisions based on data and based on evidence. What are really accessible, concrete formats that would work? And we've done a needs assessment, and then we looked at what people are telling us, what kind of support they would like to have, and had them themselves creatively work on specific support solutions. So peer-to-peer methodological exchange is something that doesn't exist that much. It's complicated for people to come out and talk about how they do monitoring and evaluation in their organizations, but it's something that we found was really important to encourage. Also, presentations of how did you, once you had an evaluation, external or internal, it doesn't matter, how did you use the lessons learned to then inform your decisions. And something called evaluation consultation hours, where we are hoping that professional networks could provide people with contacts to university professors, people who have experience with evaluation, with external evaluation, to talk about how can we develop our own monitoring evaluation learning system. Obviously, again, as already touched upon data, it's really important to discuss even before the analysis starts how the data will be interpreted, anonymized, pseudonymized, etc., especially in sensitive contexts in which we work. Yeah, thank you for listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to the hopefully controversial discussion and the interesting questions that you have coming our way.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sedla. That was a very, very interesting and insightful presentation. we heard from Stein that unfortunately he cannot make it to our session, currently traveling and experiencing delays, which is a shame. On the bright side, this gives us a bit more time to discuss. And let me direct a call at our participants and say that please feel free to now express yourself by either raising your hand, asking a question in the Q&A section. You can also use the chat if you like. I'll try to do my best to monitor all these different options. And perhaps I'm already going to ask a few questions to both our presenters. To Teresa, I think that was a really, really interesting presentation and gave some really good examples that show how the evidence base is perhaps developing in the field, what different tools we have now available to make use of evidence. But I'd like to ask you how you, as someone who works with these tools, experiences the evolution of the evidence base. Like, what are its limitations? How do you think we can improve further the sharing of evidence? Like, where do you see constraints there? How can we make things more accessible? I guess the problem is that, you know, sharing through systematic reviews, for instance, comes with a number of constraints, right? In systematic reviews are not always updated, especially if the evidence is quickly evolving, right? Like a few years into systematic review, we would ideally need a new one to inform us about the latest research. They're hard to read, they're long documents. They don't provide much information about individual arguments, but rather you know, a sort of quantitative summary. So what do you see as options that we have perhaps available? How can we learn from other disciplines also to share evidence better? And then to Svetla, I mean, you mentioned a lot of interesting things. So a few follow-up questions, but maybe let me start with one. So you mentioned the transparency challenge, right? So in a way, in-house evaluations are perhaps quite interesting for organizations because they can so control a bit better what is shared with which group. And I'm wondering if you could give us an example of how, as an evaluator, you navigate that kind of question, right? Like, do you have an example of how this transparency issue is discussed in organizations? What kinds of recommendations you would maybe give as to what should be shared with an external audience, what should be shared internally? I would be very interested to just get also a bit more of a feel of what you have experienced in your own work. And I see that we have a question also in the Q&A. So let me also read that one out. This is to Teresa from Martin Snow. Thank you for your presentation. Do you know if PCVE practitioners are using some of the research tools and findings that you refer to influence and enhance operational practice?
Okay,
Teresa, do you want to start?
Thank you. If we have the rest of the afternoon, Stefan, and thank you, Martin, for your question, to answer your question. I mean, evidence is complicated from my perspective. I mean, the great success in evidence-based medicine was when schools of medicine taught all their students to critical appraisal the scientific evidence. So, and they started doing this in the academic years, right? So you had a whole bunch of a whole new generation of medical doctors coming out in the late 90s that would know how to appraise critically the scientific literature, and therefore they could apply to their own practice. Now, one of very important things that we do not have perhaps in our heads when we think in evidence-based medicine, that medical doctors are reading scientific articles more or less very frequently. So it's not that, oh, I read the systematic review, I have what I need for my program, I do the program and I forget about this. No, being a practitioner or a medical doctor, psychologist, social worker, whatever, implies that in your profession, one of the tasks that you have is that you are always upgrading yourself. So you have to incorporate that kind of mechanics that you, as part of your task, as part of your professional ethics is to be as most updated as possible in the scientific literature. Now, a lot of problems with this because medical doctors have access to scientific evidence that many people do not have. They have access because they go to the hospitals, at least what I know. I don't know in other countries, but the countries that I know, the libraries of the hospitals give them access to that payroll or to that articles that are behind the payroll, and they do not have to pay for this. I don't know if social workers have this. I don't think that social workers, for example, have this facility, right? And some articles, it costs what, $35 per an article, so it's expensive scientific evidence. We have to work in many fronts in order to be able to have practitioners working really evidence-based. And this, I go, Martin, with your question. I am not a specialist in PCAV. I'm more in general crime prevention. My experience is that people are in this moment very obsessed with evaluation because everyone is working on evaluation, but people don't know yet how to use evidence. People don't know how to read evidence because it's complicated, and we do not prepare from the academic, from their undergraduates, master studies. We do not prepare people with competence, or it is not still in the objectives of the curriculums of the educational curriculums that the people, when goes outside, knows to critically appraise scientific evidence. For example, quality of evidence. It's better this study, it's better the other study. I'm doing a type of, for example, a mediation model. In what form the mediation model is different of a moderation model. And this is important for you to decide about the activities that you do on your programs, because it's not the same moderation than mediation, and you cannot have the same thought when you design a strategy, for example, if you have a moderation or if you have mediation. So we still, in my perspective, have a long way to go to effective evidence-based practice. We should start to teach this from the schools. We have in Sweden University the plan of trying to start to courses specifically on evidence-based, but let's see what's going to happen. And it's still a long way to go to create this habit of working, of updating, of having access to evidence on an easy way, etc. So we are in the good way, but we still have a long way to go, in my perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. Zetla, over to you.
Thank you. Maybe to add to what Teresa was saying, I think that professional networks have a role to play as well. Of course, universities have to lay the groundwork for people to be able to understand data, understand how methods differ and how quality of data differs. But also afterwards, once we are all in our very stressful day-to-day lives, it's maybe also important to be reminded by the professional knowledge networks that not all data is created equal, and maybe be given some incentives on where to look, just like you did in your presentation. I would find that very useful. Now to go back to Stefan's initial question about transparency. And you wanted a practical example. So I'm going to go straight for the practical example. They are, for example, we are in the context of PEVA, we've had the funding to try out one specific evaluation design that doesn't focus on a specific program's intervention, but focuses on a whole network of actors around the client. So watch this space for this publication on how that evaluation design works. This was not an in-house evaluation, but it still has the challenges of how to deal with transparency, because you not only you can in the span of trying out this very complex new evaluation design, you can only concentrate on a few cases. And so you need to afterwards make sure that all your findings are presented in a legal way in which the clients are completely protected, but also still have some merit to both evaluation science and also, the practical work. And so this really is a question of phrasing. It's sometimes a question of how you actually write. And that also applies to talking to the clients, because in order, for obvious ethical reasons, in order to include them, their perspectives in the evaluation, why you're asking them these questions and what you're hoping to get out of it. And they have the right to, after a certain time where you've analyzed things, to also ask, so what came out of that actually? And there you also have to present some findings in an accessible way. If you are taking, the human rights approach seriously. And for policymakers, I think it's also really important to contextualize for them. This is what we were hoping to get out of this in terms of questions answered. These were the limitations of what we could not prove, because sometimes causation, for example, in impact evaluations is just really hard to get to with a very small n number. I think we all know about methodological problems of evaluation, but in order to, when you present the results, also contextualize them and make it clear what you are actually able to say and what you're not able to say. And I think a good practice, not a perfect practice, obviously is to include stakeholders in that final analysis stages. Not necessarily include them in the interpretation of data as I don't completely agree, for example, with Michael Quinn Patton that you should include the subjects and all the stakeholders in all interpretation. But I do agree that when you are actually writing the recommendations, they should be included, because they also know which of these recommendations are realistic at all in the scope of the context that they're working in. And that's a question then of representation and also representing to the public and to your colleagues and so forth. But I hope that once we get used to a good evaluation practice, once we get used to doing both external and internal evaluations, we will also have an easier way to speak to our colleagues that have the same challenges in their own organizations, just on methodological questions, without fearing each other as much. That is my hope and my vision.
Stefan, can I just add something on Svetla says? It is important also consider that evaluation that you do is evidence for other person to use. I mean, we all should construct the body of knowledge all together. When you do an effort for doing an evaluation and put out that results that you obtain with what level, the efficacy, the efficiency of your program, this is going to be extremely useful for others that have the same problem that you have. And in basically, I mean, many times I see this in crime prevention, you are starting from the beginning, in reinventing the wheel again and again, instead of looking at what other people that had already very smartly used their heads and their creativity do after you adopt to your population, right? So it is important, because the thing is that we have, or in this moment, I think we are discussing very much evaluation has to show to someone that our programs work. Yes, but to show to everyone. And everyone is the other colleague in the other country that is working the same that you do. So it's constructing that this medical, the medical field has this very, very clear, right? When you get to a systematic review, you have 500 small studies or big studies that have been looking to the same, and they could construct this big, big body of evidence in saying, okay, if you have a myocardial infarction, you have to take 3 milligrams of blood thinners because they really prevent you to have another infarction. So, and they have it so clear because they have this big body of evidence, but we are just concerned to show to the ones who pay for us, or to the government, or to the municipality, or to whoever is sponsoring our program, to show that it works. And I think we have to start to have in our heads that it's bigger than this. Evidence is evidence for everyone. Knowledge must be available for everyone. What you do.
I completely agree. There should be, you know, a democracy to it. But
Yeah.
I think it's also I don't know how quickly we'll get there. So in the meantime, I would also really be happy if already inside the organization, this knowledge that is created, this evidence that is generated, as you presented in the beginning of your presentation, if that gets shared also internally, because it's a question of leadership as well, to be taking that on and being open to suggestions and to different interpretations, and to a diversity of hypotheses on why did this specific thing happen in that specific case. So yeah, I think Heidi Mayberg asked a very interesting question that I might need to think about. Stefan, maybe you can read it out, and we'll all think about it before.
Of course, I'd be happy to. So the question is, interventions should be as tailor-made as possible. How to balance between being evidence-based in your work, providing tailor-made approaches, and having resources to conduct evidence-based evaluation per case. Who of you would like to make a first attempt?
I can start from this, and this reminds me very much my students when they are working for their thesis, and they say, "Oh, I did not find studies that addressed exactly my research question." And it's like, of course you are not, because no one has done your question. But you have researchers that work in your field, that work with the same population, that, for example, do not know how the program works with this specific population of adolescents who have also another types of crimes committed, etc. But you perhaps have the same done in schools, in kids that have not previously committed other types of crimes, and from there you can estimate, or you can extrapolate to your population what you have. So it's a matter that, or for example, when you go to risk factors, right? So you know exactly what evidence is telling you about risk factors, and you can plan your activity and still look at other interventions that have done something similar. So I completely agree with you in that interventions should be tailored to the characteristics of our population and our problem. But adaptation is something that we should think more than I think we think. So you have already things that you know that work very well. Okay. This is a problem because we do not think yet has a problem-solving approach that we should think, right? Designing interventions is a problem-solving task. We have a problem, we develop a solution, so let's try if the solution works or not. Perhaps it's work, but perhaps we can improve it. In the evaluation, we see, okay, this is not good enough. We can improve this because we know all the small pieces of the machine, right? Of how everything works. So we change a small cog on that engine, and we improve the results of our intervention. And in the same way, we can think on when you tailor to the characteristics of the problem that we are working with, that specific intervention, work on there with that characteristics. Because it should be described every step and every decision and argumented why we choose to do this and this and this. And you say, okay, but we have a different type of population here. I am going to change this small aspect of the intervention, and then I tailor it to my population. So it is, again, that type of problem-solving approach, thinking in saying, what are the solutions? The solutions were fine for what? Perhaps I can use similar solution for my case. But you adapt. You do not start from the beginning. You construct your intervention in base of knowledge that is already on there, so you do not start as a blank page.
If I can add to that, sorry,
go
on. I'm only the moderator, so I don't want to take up more space than necessary, but just briefly to what Teresa said, which I think was already a very good answer to that question, is I think it's important to think of evidence-based policy design, initiative design, not as a process where we necessarily need to have solid evidence that, you know, whatever you're going to do now will definitely work. I think it's important to, you know, to consider all evidence that is available. I think that's what this speaks to, and it may be that what you're doing or what you're proposing is quite an innovative solution to a problem. And I think if that is the case, then it's all the more important that you then carefully think about how you will evaluate the progress of your initiative, right? So that you clearly think through a theory of change, that you think through what the evaluation process along the line might look like. But I think it's and this comes up, I think, across disciplines. Like it's not a kind of program evidence-based project evaluation that should discourage innovative thinking, right? So I think that's maybe important to highlight. Svetlana, before I hand over to you, let me also read out another question that came in by Matti Cantel. And the question, maybe we can have it on the screen as well. How can an exit worker improve her competences as an evidence-based practitioner? How do we best assess her present skills and develop her approach? At the time of posing this question, I must admit that I need to leave rather soon. Right? So I don't know who that is. That was Matti Cantel. Okay, so we're trying to address this question quickly. Is there someone who would like to?
I can maybe pick up on that, since I also see that. Yeah, I see that Matti Cantel is still with us, so I'm hoping that we maybe manage to get a quick response. I think inside your teams there should be a discussion on how much space for self-reflection do we have, and how much time do we get to, for example, read something, which I know is a challenge. Believe me, it's true for the research personnel as well as the practitioners on the ground, that it is always a challenge to attribute that time. Also in intercollegial interventions, that can certain elements of monitoring and evaluation can be added to that, just as a method, as a pedagogical method, to teach us to think in a self-critical, self-reflective manner. And I think what helps is having had a good experience with these methods and having felt taken seriously in your expertise. So yeah, I hope you get to be in an environment that encourages that kind of self-reflection.
And if I can add, for example, the Indeed project is going to make available a series of tools that you will have available online that can start making you have that kind of mechanism of syncing evidence, so evaluation, how to use evidence, and having available in the website the repositories, articles. And I mean, it's from my perspective, is a matter of practicing, it's a matter of doing it, it's a matter, and it's life is trial error. Sometimes you are going to commit errors because you don't know, but that's error is a very good way of learning, very potent way of learning. So yeah, it's the way of just trying to do it. But yeah, I think the Indeed project has available these tools in the internet. The CPN also have some tools for evaluation materials in general crime prevention that can also be useful.
Maybe I would like to add something very quick to what Heidi was asking before. It's maybe a bit of a technical solution, the evaluators thinking in evaluators terms, but I think something that we don't use sufficiently and that we should advocate for to get funding on is ex ante evaluations. So evaluations that happen before a project starts or an initiative starts. And looking at relevance in a specific context. So, for example, if you want to have a universal prevention project in professional schools, what are the phenomena that these kids are dealing with? What are the topics that they discuss? What are potential radicalization risks that exist in this specific target group? That is something that obviously practitioners had a lot of personal experience on, but we are also all prone to have some anecdotal knowledge, because that's how the human mind works. So to get a bit of space to do a more systematic analysis of a context, I think is very important. And I hope that the funding parties that also, give us the money, right? The TORs will also start to consider this as important, as I think practitioners do, because otherwise sustainability becomes an issue.
Okay, let me maybe ask one more question to Svetla. So you mentioned the benefits of an internal evaluation, and one of the reasonings was that this maybe helps also to familiarize people with the idea of conducting an evaluation. It may be a bit lower threshold than an external evaluation. And again, I'm wondering from your experience whether you have seen an internal evaluation as a potential, whether this has been experienced as a potential stepping stone towards developing an organizational evaluation culture. Like, does that also make people perhaps more interested in taking it a step further and having an external evaluator come in? Or do you see perhaps sometimes the opposite effect, which I guess is a bit the danger, the potential danger, that people get very comfortable with internal evaluations and think, well, maybe this works for us, right? Like, we've got good experiences with internal evaluations, so why, there's no need for someone external?
I think that's a very fair question. Based on my experience in the PCVE field, it's the other way around. People first make experiences with external evaluation. And it can be very good and it can be very interesting, and it can be also targeted towards their pedagogical interests, but it can also be rushed and uninterested in presenting interim results or any, and it can feel like an exercise in futility. So if they have had bad experiences with external evaluations, they also will not be open to internal evaluations. And that is an unfortunate effect that we should be aware of. But I have personally, in another field, not in the PCVE field, in another field that I was working in before, when I was really young, when I was still in university and was having my first experiences with evaluations, I was working on an internal evaluation, and my supervisor noticed that my language is euphemistic. And he sat me down and he said, "Your language is euphemistic. Why is that?" And I was very surprised, I have to admit, by that, because first of all, I hadn't noticed myself. And second of all, that in the context of an internal evaluation, someone would put me on the spot that way and be like, "You're not being critical enough." Was a very, very important learning experience for myself. And I've experienced this as actual freedom, of academic thinking, of free thinking. But it is a fair question that people might not be then open to external criticism, and it should never be a one-way solution. Obviously, both of those things are needed, both external evaluations and internal evaluations. I think that they can focus on different things, and ideally also intertwine in meaningful ways, where just because of funding is also limited, you might want to you might have 10 research questions that you would like to apply to a specific context, but you only get to work on 4, and maybe 2 can be worked on in the context of internal evaluation, and 2 can be worked on in the context of external evaluation. And maybe that's a hopeful approach.
Okay, thank you very much. So I do not see any further questions from the audience. I'm aware, of course, that we also have one speaker less, so we already had quite a substantial discussion. We're able to answer all the questions. So if you agree, if this is okay with you, we could also say we leave it here, give each other a longer break before we continue with the program. So I'd like to thank again both our speakers, Teresa Silva, Svetlana Konova. It's really nice to have you here. That was very, very interesting, great presentations. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the coming sessions. So everyone, enjoy the rest of this conference and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you.